The war in Europe had been raging for years when a skinny 17-year-old kid stepped off a bus and walked into a U.S. Army recruiting office in Texas. His name was Audie Murphy. Small, quiet, badly undernourished, and barely weighing 100 pounds, he looked nothing like a future hero. He didn't look like a soldier at all. America's military was gearing up to fight on multiple fronts, and thousands of strong, confident young men were signing up nationwide. Big men, athletes, leaders, men who looked like soldiers. Audie Murphy didn't fit the picture. He didn't fit the expectation. He was the kind kid officers glanced at once and dismissed with a single thought, "Hunch," and that was exactly what happened. The first time he tried to join the Marines, they rejected him. Too small. The paratroopers turned him down. Too weak. Even the Navy took one look and sent him home. He had no college degree, no special skills, no social standing. He was just poor farm boy from Texas, whose father had abandoned the family and whose mother had died only months earlier. By every military standard of the day, Audie Murphy was a failure before he ever set foot on the battlefield. But Murphy didn't see himself the way everyone else did. He didn't see the weakness they saw. He didn't accept the limitations others decided for him. While every branch of the military tried to keep him out, he kept trying to get in. He kept pushing. He kept showing up. And finally, the Army agreed to take him. Not because they wanted him, but because the country needed manpower. His destiny began in the organization that wanted him the least. Training camp was brutal. The Army had never lowered its standards for anyone, especially not for a kid who could barely carry a full pack. Murphy struggled physically, fell behind in drills, and was ridiculed by soldiers who looked more like Hollywood war heroes than he ever would. They joked that he would never survive combat. They said he was a liability, a burden, a mistake. But there was something different about Murphy that nobody saw yet. Something that had nothing to do with size or muscle. It was a rare combination of fearlessness and indifference to danger. He didn't panic under stress. He didn't freeze in emergencies. He didn't waste time thinking about fear. He only thought about what needed to be done. And soon, the same men who mocked him began to notice that Murphy never backed down from any challenge. He volunteered for everything: reconnaissance patrols, night patrols, dangerous assignments that other soldiers politely avoided. He studied German tactics. He practiced his weapon handling until he could reload blindfolded. He learned to move through terrain without being seen or heard. Murphy wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. Deep down, he understood something many young soldiers never do. No rules, rank, or reputation could protect a man from combat. The battlefield didn't care what schools you attended. It didn't care about your muscles, medals, or opinions. All that mattered was courage and decision-making when everything else went wrong. Murphy didn't know it yet, but those qualities were the exact ones the U.S. Army needed in Europe. By the spring of 1943, the war had become a brutal grind of attrition. The German army was entrenched across Italy and France. American units were bleeding manpower as they fought to advance yard by yard, ridge by ridge, village by village. Commanders needed men who could think under fire, take initiative, and fight when the situation turned hopeless. They needed men who didn't break under pressure. And in that desperate environment, the young failure from Texas began to show his true potential. When Murphy finally deployed to Europe, everything changed. The real battlefield did not care how small he was. The real battlefield didn't give him a physical fitness test or measure his confidence. It only asked one question: could he fight? The first time his unit came under fire, the answer became obvious. While other soldiers dove for cover and waited for orders, Murphy didn't hesitate. He moved forward. He fired first. He acted faster than anyone else. His instincts were astonishing. His accuracy was lethal. His ability to control fear was unnatural. Murphy didn't look like a warrior. But on the battlefield, he was something far more dangerous than a strong soldier. He was smart. He was calm. He was aggressive. He made decisions instantly. He was the man who stepped forward when everyone else stepped back. The Army's opinion shifted overnight. The officers who once saw him as too small now saw him as someone who didn't seem to understand the meaning of the word impossible. The men who had joked about his size began to follow him. He wasn't just a capable soldier. He was becoming something the U.S. Army desperately needed. Murph. When Audie Murphy reached the front lines in Italy, he was no longer the skinny kid trying to prove he could be a soldier. He was exactly where he wanted to be, in a real war, against a real enemy, with real consequences. And that was where the Army discovered something nobody could have predicted. Fight between. The first time Murphy's unit made contact with German forces, everything went wrong. The enemy struck from higher ground, their machine guns pinning the Americans down in a brutal crossfire. Soldiers around Murphy were shouting, scrambling for cover, waiting for orders. Officers were yelling into radios. The entire company was stunned by the sudden ambush. It looked like a disaster. It looked like the beginning of a slaughter. It wasn't chaos to him. It was a problem. And unlike the others, he didn't freeze. He didn't dive into the nearest foxhole. He didn't wait for instructions. He acted. Murphy moved with total clarity of purpose. He advanced into the fire, laying down a steady rhythm of shots that forced the Germans to relocate and hide behind cover. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't panicking. He was thinking faster than anyone else, stepping precisely where he needed to go and firing at exactly the angles he needed to control the situation. It was the first time anyone saw the real version of the man they had dismissed as too weak and too small. Officers who had ignored him were now watching him take the initiative that everyone else lacked. The soldiers who once joked about him suddenly realized they were watching someone who could actually win a firefight. When the battle was over, the company had survived a situation that should have ended in disaster. Murphy had earned respect the only way that mattered in war. He earned it with action, not words. And that was just the beginning. As the campaign in Italy ground forward through mountains, shattered towns, and deadly snipers, Murphy's reputation grew. His commanders learned that if they needed a scouting patrol, he volunteered. If the unit needed a man to advance into enemy territory, he stepped forward. If they needed someone to stay behind and cover a retreat, he stayed. Soon that pattern became too obvious to ignore. Murphy wasn't chasing glory. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was simply doing the one thing ordinary soldiers fear. By 1944, the war had moved into France, and the German army was far from beaten. The fighting grew more violent and more desperate. Villages changed hands dozens of times. Artillery shook the earth day and night. Units disappeared in forests and hills and were never seen again. But in the middle of all of it, something else was happening. Murphy was becoming the Army's most reliable weapon. Every mission he took part in seemed to end the same way. The enemy defeated, the objective secured, his comrades alive. His fellow soldiers stopped viewing him as a runt or a misfit. They began seeing him as the man they trusted when everything fell apart. And they were right to trust him. On one mission, Murphy led an assault against a German machine gun nest dug into a hillside. The position had already taken casualties from the Americans. Attacking it again meant death. Nobody wanted to move. So Murphy took it upon himself to crawl forward alone. Inch by inch, under enemy fire. He got close enough to destroy the position himself. His attack saved the entire platoon. He was awarded the first of his military decorations for that action. It wouldn't be his last. Murphy wasn't simply surviving the battlefield. He was dominating it. His instincts for combat were unlike anything his commanders had ever seen. He had an uncanny ability to anticipate where the enemy was, how they would attack, and how to defeat them. But note, the orders were clear, fall back. Murphy broke them. He didn't do it for pride or heroism. He did it because he understood something the officers didn't. If the men retreated together, the Germans would shoot them down. Someone needed to hold the line. Someone needed to stay behind. Someone needed to delay the enemy long enough for the others to escape. Nobody volunteered. Nobody even considered it. Murphy's. He became something the German army had never seen before. A one-man defense against an entire attack. While others retreated for cover, Murphy held his ground alone. He didn't care about rank. He didn't care about reputation. He didn't care about the fact that he was exposed, vulnerable, and standing on a vehicle filled with ammunition that could explode at any second. He cared about one thing: saving his men. That was the moment when the war stopped being about proving himself. It became about the only thing a real soldier ever truly values: the lives of the men beside him. And the Germans were about to learn exactly who they were up against. The sky over eastern France was gray and heavy with smoke the day Audie Murphy climbed onto that burning tank destroyer. Snow covered the fields, and every explosion sent white powder into the air, like the battlefield itself was shivering. His unit was falling back through the trees, trying to regroup before the German counterattack overwhelmed them. It was chaos. Shells were landing all around them. German armor was advancing with infantry and support. The Americans were outnumbered, outgunned, and dangerously exposed. If the line broke completely, dozens of soldiers would die. Murphy didn't care. He didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the flaming tank destroyer and hauled himself onto the top of it. Flames licked up the shattered hull. Ammunition inside was cooking off in small bursts. Every second it looked like the thing might explode beneath him. But Murphy ignored the obvious danger. He saw what nobody else saw: a chance. Mounted on the tank destroyer was a functional .50 caliber machine gun, a weapon that could tear through advancing infantry and force tanks to stay back. It was the one piece of equipment on the battlefield capable of stopping the German attack long enough for the retreating Americans to reorganize. Murphy grabbed the handles and opened fire. The first burst ripped through the German infantry, forcing the assault line to drop and scatter for cover. The enemy wasn't prepared for a defense like that. And they definitely weren't prepared for a single man standing exposed on top of a burning vehicle firing at them like he had nothing left to lose. German officers adjusted quickly. They shouted orders and directed mortar fire toward Murphy. Shells exploded closer and closer. Shrapnel cracked against the tank destroyer. Bullets chipped paint and ricocheted off metal. A crewman nearby yelled at Murphy to get down. He refused. "You go, I'm staying." For the next hour, Murphy fought alone. He fired until the machine gun glowed hot in his hands. He changed firing angles so constantly that the Germans believed there were multiple gunners. He moved the barrel from target to target with an unnatural calm. While officers on both sides yelled commands and artillery tore up the earth around him, Murphy kept his mind fixed on one single, simple mission: keep the Germans from advancing. He cut down waves of infantry, stopped troop carriers, and forced tank crews to retreat and reposition. Enemy mortars zeroed in on him. The tank destroyer shuddered under impact after impact. Men watching from the woods thought he had been killed a dozen different times. But every time the smoke cleared, he was still there, still firing. The German infantry grew desperate. They started swarming toward him from different angles, trying to flank his position and overrun him. But Murphy didn't panic. He shifted fire like a machine. His aim was exact, efficient, and deadly. The soldiers who had once thought him too weak, too scrawny, too small to fight, watched as the man they underestimated held the entire German assault at bay. While still standing on top of the tank destroyer, still being targeted by tanks, still under fire, He grabbed a field phone and radioed his artillery support. The operator on the other end couldn't believe what he was hearing. The voice requesting fire support wasn't coming from a position behind cover. It wasn't even coming from a safe distance. Murphy was calling artillery on the Germans from only a few dozen yards away. Let them come a little closer. The Americans opened fire. Artillery crashed down behind the German advance, cutting off their support and trapping them between Murphy's position and the American guns. The field became a kill zone. Enemy soldiers tried to find cover. There was none. They tried to retreat. There was nowhere to go. Murphy stayed. He waited until his men were safely regrouped and ready. Only then did he climb off the tank destroyer. His uniform was scorched. His face was black with smoke. His hands were burned from the overheated machine gun. His body was streaked with blood, not all of it his. He had fought alone for more than an hour. He had faced armor, artillery, and infantry by himself. And he had stopped them. When the battle ended, Murphy refused medical evacuation. He stayed on the line. He kept leading his men. Because for him, the war wasn't about medals or heroism. His fellow soldiers had once dismissed him. Now they looked at him with something different in their eyes. Not awe, not admiration, not even respect. They looked at him with trust. Murphy had done what no one else could. He had held back an entire German attack. He had turned certain defeat into survival. And he had bought his men the time they needed to live. The battlefield had proven what no recruiter, no officer, no armchair strategist ever could. Audie Murphy wasn't just a good soldier. He was when the smoke cleared and the German attack finally faltered. The battlefield looked like the aftermath of a natural disaster. The snow was churned into mud. Bodies littered the field. Ammunition cans were scattered everywhere. And the once silent forest echoed with the dying roar of artillery. Audie Murphy stood where he had been for over an hour, on top of the burned-out tank destroyer, looking like a ghost pulled from the flames. The men from his company emerged slowly from the trees, stunned that anyone had survived the assault. Many of them had assumed Murphy was dead. Some believed no one could remain in the open under that much fire and walk away. But there he was, burned, bruised, battered, and still carrying his rifle. They expected him to collapse. He didn't. He climbed down from the wreckage, checked his ammunition, and immediately started directing the counterattack. His voice cut through the battlefield with the same clarity and confidence he showed in the firefight. The men didn't need orders from headquarters. They didn't need to wait for permission. They followed the one man who had stood between them and certain death, and that's when the tide turned. With Murphy leading from the front, the battered American line reformed and pushed forward. The Germans had expected the U.S. soldiers to break. They never imagined they would attack, especially not after the carnage they had just endured. But Murphy had taken the fight out of them. He had broken their momentum. He had shattered their will. The counterattack didn't last long. The Germans withdrew in confusion, leaving equipment and wounded men behind. Their assault had failed, not because of artillery, not because of tanks, not because of superior numbers or reinforcements. It had failed because of one soldier. Years at, no matter how many times they checked the accounts, no matter how many soldiers they interviewed, the result never changed. One man had taken responsibility for holding the line. One man had turned a retreat into a defense. One man had saved the entire company. That was the difference between Audie Murphy and every other soldier who served with him. He didn't measure his actions in terms of medals or promotions. He measured them by a simple rule: never leave your brothers behind. The men in his unit never forgot that. Many of them owed their lives to him. And word of what happened spread fast, first through the company, then through the regiment, then through the entire division. The story reached headquarters. Generals demanded reports. Commanders wanted details. Military journalists wanted names. But medals weren't the end of the story. In many ways, they were just the beginning. When the official presentation was scheduled, Murphy wanted nothing to do with it. He avoided attention, hated crowds, and privately blamed himself for the men he couldn't save. To him, the battle would always be a tragedy. He didn't feel like the hero people claimed he was. He felt like a soldier who did what was necessary. What Murphy didn't realize was that he had become something far larger than a battlefield legend. He had become a symbol of the American soldier, the ordinary man who rises to the moment when fate demands it. Reporters wanted interviews. Officers wanted him transferred to safer positions. Politicians wanted to meet him. Hollywood wanted to immortalize him. Murphy refused most of it. He returned to his unit and kept fighting, because the war wasn't over. There were more battles ahead, more danger, more men who needed a leader they could trust. Audie Murphy could have stayed behind the lines. He could have gone home. He could have disappeared into safety and fame. By stepping forward when everyone else stepped back, the world would remember what he did on that frozen battlefield in France. But the story of Audie Murphy was not about one battle. It was about a truth every combat veteran understands. Courage. It's the decision to stand your ground when fear tells you to run. And that, when the fighting in Europe finally slowed and the war moved toward its closing act, the soldiers who had survived began thinking about home. They counted their days. They talked about family. They imagined peace, quiet, and a life without gunfire. Audie Murphy should have been one of them. He had earned every right to return home early. He had nothing left to prove. But he didn't leave. He stayed with his unit until the war's final phase, fighting through the shattered towns and ruined forests of Germany as the Allied armies closed in. Murphy wasn't chasing medals anymore. He wasn't trying to be a hero. He was doing what he believed every soldier owed to the men beside him. Finish the job together. When Germany finally surrendered in May 1945, the end came almost quietly. One moment, soldiers were firing artillery and clearing bunkers. The next, there was silence. A war that had consumed continents and destroyed millions of lives had stopped in an instant. But for Murphy, silence didn't feel like peace. He had spent years in combat. He had watched friends die. He had endured explosions, bullets, artillery, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. He had slept in bombed-out houses, marched through winter storms, and buried men he had sworn to protect. The end of the war didn't erase any of that. It only reminded him of how much had been lost. When he finally returned to the United States, the world he knew had changed. The skinny farm boy who had enlisted because he had nowhere else to go came home as the most decorated soldier in American history. Newspapers wrote about him. Crowds cheered him. Politicians wanted to meet him. Children asked for his autograph. America was But Murphy didn't feel like one. He avoided interviews when he could. He turned down parades. He tried to disappear into civilian life, but the world wouldn't let him. In Hollywood, producers wanted him to play himself in a film about his life. That movie, To Hell and Back, would later become one of the most successful war films of its generation. But Murphy himself didn't enjoy the spotlight. When reporters asked him how one man could accomplish what he did in France, he always gave the same simple answer. I was just trying to protect my men. To most people, it sounded like humility. In reality, it was something deeper. Murphy. In the years after the war, Murphy struggled with what we now call PTSD, long before the term existed. The nightmares never truly left him. The battlefield was always in the back of his mind, the gunfire, the screams, the explosions. When he slept, he dreamed of Germany. When he woke, he carried the ghosts of men he couldn't save. But even in peacetime, Murphy's courage never left him. He used his fame not for wealth or privilege, but to speak for the soldiers who returned home, damaged and forgotten. He fought for veterans' rights, for better treatment, for medical support, for those who were suffering silently. In a way, it was the same battle he fought in France. But this time, the enemy wasn't an army. It was indifference. Audie Murphy never wanted to be remembered for killing the enemy. He wanted to be remembered for protecting his friends. And as the years passed, that idea became his true legacy. He wasn't the biggest soldier. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the most experienced. He was a quiet kid who had been rejected by every branch of the military. A kid who was judged by his size instead of his heart. A kid who never backed away from danger when others needed him most. The story of Audie Murphy isn't just about a Medal of Honor or battlefield heroics. It's about the truth that every veteran understands. Heroes aren't chosen by destiny. They are shaped by the moments when failure isn't an option. Murphy's life after the war wasn't peaceful or easy. He battled trauma, loss, and memories that refused to fade. But he never stopped fighting for others. He never stopped caring about the men who served beside him. And he never once claimed that he deserved the fame that followed him. Because deep down, he remained the same soldier he had been on the battlefield. A man who believed that courage isn't measured by medals, but by responsibility. A man who believed that fear doesn't define a soldier. It reveals one. Audie Murphy had been called too small, too weak, and too inexperienced to serve. The military had tried to keep him out. Some officers had written him off. Others had doubted he would ever survive. But when the world needed him, he became the one man the enemy could not stop. The one soldier who stood alone when everyone else retreated. The one American who held the line when history demanded it. And in doing so, he proved one of the most powerful truths the battlefield has ever revealed. Greatness doesn't always look like a hero. Sometimes, it looks like the man no one believed in. Audie Murphy never asked for fame. He never asked to become the most decorated soldier of World War II. He never asked to be the national symbol he eventually became. All he ever wanted was a chance to fight, a chance to serve, and a chance to protect the men beside him. Yet history had chosen him for something far greater than he ever imagined. In the years that followed the war, Murphy tried to live a normal life. He tried ranching, he tried business, he tried acting. But nothing ever truly felt as real or as meaningful as the battlefield. The violence and the heroism of war had carved something into him that peace could never erase. It wasn't just experience. It was identity. The battlefield had taught him who he really was. Hollywood turned him into a celebrity. But Murphy never enjoyed the attention. People were fascinated by the idea that the greatest American soldier of the war looked nothing like the heroes in recruiting posters. He was small, quiet, and unimposing. There was no intimidating presence, no booming voice, no larger-than-life personality. He was living proof that courage does not announce itself. Murphy used his popularity for one purpose. He fought for the soldiers who came home just like he did, carrying the invisible weight of war. He spoke publicly about what the military didn't want to acknowledge. He talked about nightmares. He talked about trauma. He talked about the memories that followed every veteran home, whether the world saw them or not. While America celebrated victory, Murphy reminded the country that the cost of war never ends at the surrender table. It continues in the minds of the survivors. The men who had fought beside him respected him deeply for that. They trusted him in peace the same way they trusted him in battle. When he spoke for veterans' rights, he spoke with the authority of someone who had carried the burden himself. But even as Murphy became a national figure, he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the recruiters who had turned him away. He never forgot the officers who doubted him. And he never forgot the battlefield where he earned the respect they refused to give him. The truth was simple. The army tried to reject him. The battlefield refused to. And because of that, Audie Murphy became something rare in American history. A hero who never sought power or recognition. He didn't fit the mold, he didn't look the part. But he replaced every failure people projected onto him with action, responsibility, and sacrifice. He proved that greatness is not defined by the expectations of others, but by the strength to overcome them. In time, America learned what the soldiers beside him always knew. Murphy wasn't a hero because of medals. He wasn't a hero because of fame. He was a hero because he never stopped fighting, for his country, for his men, and for the truth no one else wanted to say out loud. Yet the story doesn't end with Hollywood roles and national honors. The story ends in a quieter, more powerful way. With the way his fellow soldiers remembered him, not as a movie star, not as a legend, not as the most decorated soldier in American history, but as the man who didn't run when everyone else had to, the man who volunteered for the mission nobody wanted, the man who held the line when everyone else was falling back. Those were the memories they carried, because those were the moments that had saved their lives. Murphy's legacy is not a monument or a medal. It's a lesson, and generations of soldiers have carried it forward. Strength isn't always physical. Leadership isn't always loud, and Murphy's story is the answer to every young man and woman who has ever been told they were too small, too weak, too slow, or too ordinary to make a difference. He showed what can happen when someone refuses to accept the limits others place on them. He proved that a single determined individual can change the outcome of a battle. He proved that a single act of bravery can shift the course of history. In the end, Audie Murphy lived the truth that every soldier knows in their bones. Heroes are not born, they are revealed. Revealed in moments when the world demands more than most people can give. Revealed when fear has every reason to win, and someone still chooses to stand their ground. Audie Murphy stood. He held the line. He took on the impossible. And he did it not because he wanted glory, but because duty, loyalty, and honor mattered more than anything else. So when people today ask how one man could earn so many medals, survive so many battles, and carry so many scars, the answer is simple. They called him too small to fight. They called him too weak to lead. They called him a failure, until the battlefield proved that he was the one soldier no enemy could ever break. For the rest of his life, people would talk about Audie Murphy's courage. They would talk about the battles he fought, the medals he earned, and the enemies he defeated. They would talk about the legend. But Murphy knew something the public never fully understood. The higher the glory, the greater the cost. Even after the war, he still had the instincts of a soldier. When a car backfired, he dropped low and looked for cover. When someone slammed a door, he flinched. When he slept, his mind dragged him back to the battlefield. He relived the gunfire, the explosions, the screams of dying men, America. And he learned that courage is not always loud. Sometimes courage is just the ability to keep going when the war never really stops. Hollywood didn't know what to do with him at first. They expected to meet a loud, fearless warrior. Instead, they found a quiet, reserved man who rarely smiled at the cameras. Most actors were larger-than-life personalities. Murphy was smaller than life off the battlefield, simple, humble, unassuming. Producers saw the contradiction and were fascinated by it. Here was a man who could stand alone against a German attack, but hated speaking in public. Here was a man who became a hero for fighting, but couldn't fight his nightmares. Here was a man who survived every enemy on the battlefield, but struggled with himself. He accepted a few film roles, not because he wanted fame, but because he needed money. America loved seeing their war hero on screen. But while the fans cheered, Murphy was fighting something far more personal than any German soldier. He was fighting the war that lived inside him. What made it worse was that almost nobody understood PTSD in the 1940s and 50s. There were no programs for veterans, no counseling, no treatments. Many soldiers drank or isolated themselves. Many broke. The system didn't have the vocabulary for what trauma meant. They called it shell shock. They called it battle fatigue. They called it nerves. Murph, But here's the thing about Audie Murphy. He never surrendered to those scars. Just like he had done on the battlefield, he confronted them head on. He spoke out, not for himself, but for the men who were living the same nightmare. He demanded help for veterans. He demanded recognition for the invisible wounds of war. He demanded a country that celebrated its soldiers to also take responsibility for them. Because the real lesson of Audie Murphy was never about one battle, it was about what comes afterward. It is easy to be heroic in a moment of adrenaline. It is harder to live with the cost. Murphy showed both sides of the soldier's story. The courage to face the enemy, and the courage to face the memories. The boy who had once been considered too small for military service became the face of American resolve. Not because he was fearless, but because he refused to be owned by fear. His post-war life became a continuation of the same truth he had shown on the battlefield. Bravery is not about being unbreakable. Bravery is about standing up after you've been broken. And Murphy stood up again and again. A soldier who didn't quit when things got hard. A man who protected the people around him. People always asked him why he risked his life so many times. Why he fought alone when others retreated. Why he never backed down in the face of overwhelming odds. His answer was always the same. I just did what had to be done. The real hero was the man who didn't turn away when he was needed. Even as the years passed and the war slipped into history books and documentaries, Audie Murphy never escaped it. He never stopped carrying the memories of men he had fought beside or the weight of those who never returned. While the world moved forward, he remained tethered to the past, not because he wanted to stay there, but because the experience had carved itself into him. Most heroes fade into legend. Murphy didn't fade. He endured. He took roles in dozens of films, many of them westerns or war movies. People loved watching him. He delivered the kind of authenticity Hollywood couldn't manufacture. When he held a rifle on screen, he held it like a man who had actually used one in battle, not an actor pretending. When he stared down danger, it wasn't performance. It was memory. But behind every scene, every interview, every handshake, Murphy was fighting a different war. Not with bullets and tanks, but with silence, isolation, and pain. The war inside him never ended. He worked constantly. He kept himself busy. He didn't want time to think. He filled his days with filming, traveling, and writing, because distractions were easier than remembering. The moment the world got quiet, the nightmares returned. The battlefield crawled back into his mind. It wasn't courage that kept him moving. It was survival. His closest friends saw the struggle more clearly than anyone. They watched him try to balance two worlds, the world of the hero and the world of the survivor. The public saw the legend. His friends saw the scars. They understood that the price of being the most decorated soldier of the war was far greater than the medals pinned to his chest. But here is the part that most people don't know. He spoke up about PTSD decades before America admitted it existed. He testified before Congress. He demanded better treatment for veterans. He refused to let the country forget the cost of sending young men into combat. He didn't want fame for himself. He wanted dignity for the soldier who returned home afraid to sleep at night. Murphy wasn't finished serving. He was still a leader, still a protector, still the boy from Texas who refused to let fear win. And then, in 1971, something happened that no bullet, no shell, no explosion had been able to do. On a routine flight through the Appalachian Mountains, the plane he was traveling in crashed. Everyone on board was killed instantly. They didn't talk about Hollywood. They didn't talk about fame. They didn't talk about the medals. They They remembered the boy everyone underestimated, and the warrior who proved them wrong every single time. Murphy was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. Although regulations limited the decoration of graves, an exception was made for him. His headstone is simple, the same uniform white marker used for every other soldier. But the inscription contains a line that says everything about who he was, the most decorated combat soldier of World War II. People visit the grave even now. Veterans leave coins and challenge tokens. Families bring children to learn about him. Young soldiers stand silently before the headstone and read the story of a man who started life with nothing and ended life having changed everything. And his legacy wasn't made in a single moment. It wasn't made in that forest in France when he climbed onto the burning tank destroyer. It wasn't made in the endless firefights in Italy or the desperate assaults in Germany. It wasn't made in the medals, the film rolls, or the speeches. His legacy was made in the fact that he never quit. Not once. Not when the military rejected him. Not when the battlefield tried to kill him. Not when the nightmares followed him home. Not when the world expected him to be a symbol instead of a human being. He kept standing. He kept fighting. He kept living for something greater than himself. And in that way, he became more than a soldier, more than a hero, more than an American legend. He became a reminder that courage doesn't always look like strength. Sometimes courage looks like a small man doing the impossible. A reminder that true leadership isn't about authority. It's about sacrifice and responsibility. Audie Murphy was never supposed to become a soldier, yet history proved something his recruiters never saw. Sometimes the man everyone doubts is the only one capable of changing the world. History has a way of turning ordinary people into myths. The moment Audie Murphy was gone, America began polishing his story into something clean and shiny, something heroic, something patriotic, something simple. A lot of real heroes. Real courage isn't clean. Real bravery is always paid for in fear, sacrifice, and loss. The medals and the headlines made Murphy look like an invincible figure forged from steel and courage. But the truth is that he was human. He bled. He feared. He hurt. And that is exactly why his story mattered. Because when America remembered Audie Murphy, they weren't just remembering a single soldier. They were remembering every soldier who ever stepped onto a battlefield unsure if he would walk off again. They were remembering every man who had ever given more than the world expected of him. They were remembering the quiet truth of American history. Sometimes greatness comes from the last person you would ever choose. After the war, Murphy's life almost became symbolic of the country itself. America had emerged victorious but wounded, powerful but uncertain, celebrated but scarred. Murphy embodied that contradiction in the most personal way. And people sensed it, even if they didn't fully understand it. He received thousands of letters. Some from soldiers, some from families, some from children who looked up to him, some from men who had never served but saw something in Murphy that reminded them of the struggle in their own lives. The fight to overcome their circumstances, the fight to prove themselves, the fight to be something more. Murphy became a role model not because he was fearless, but because he was honest about struggle. He didn't pretend that war was glorious. He didn't pretend that heroism was easy. He didn't pretend that the battlefield ended when peace was declared. He lived with that reality every day. And in doing so, he created a bridge between America's past and America's future. He reminded the country that its strength has never come from perfection. It has always come from ordinary people who rise to extraordinary moments. That, even today, military academies and leadership courses study his actions. They analyze the calm decision-making, the refusal to abandon his unit, the willingness to stand alone when the situation demanded it. They look at the moment in France when the German army advanced across that snowy field and ask a single question. What makes a man decide to stay when everyone else is ordered to leave? It wasn't training. It wasn't doctrine. It was character, Wall. That is the definition of leadership. Not giving commands, not wearing rank, but standing where others will not. Generals and historians often talk about strategy, tactics, and objectives. They debate the decisions that win wars and the mistakes that lose them. Murphy's story cuts through all of that, because his story answers the oldest question in military history. When everything goes wrong, who do you want standing beside you? The biggest man? The loudest man? The man with the best title? Or the man who will never leave you behind? That was why Murphy belonged not just to history, but to every soldier who followed after him. His life was a lesson that size isn't strength, that experience isn't destiny, that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but the willingness to walk toward danger rather than away from it. As the decades passed, Murphy's story continued to grow. Schools were named after him. Highways, military bases, museums. Veterans organizations adopted his name. Film clips of his battles became part of training and documentary footage. Recruits learned his story not just as history, but as identity. Because in the end, Audie Murphy didn't just represent a moment in World War II. He represented a country that has always been underestimated. A country that has always fought against impossible odds. A country that has always relied on ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And America never forgot that. Even young soldiers today who have never heard the details of the war know the name. They hear it whispered in boot camp. They see it on plaques and monuments. They learn it from old veterans who still remember the war as if it happened yesterday. The legend continues not because of medals or movies, but because of the story at its core. A man who should have failed became the man who saved everyone else. Yes, because Audie Murphy proved something that the world always forgets until it is too late. Sometimes, the men who seem least likely to succeed are the ones who carry the world on their shoulders. There are many kinds of heroes in American history. Some are remembered because they led armies or commanded fleets. Some shaped the nation through politics or innovation. Others stood at podiums and changed the world with words. But the heroism of Audie Murphy came from somewhere far more raw and far more human. He was supposed to be another young man, turned away by the military. Another soldier who vanished into the endless shadows of war. Another casualty of fate. But when the nation needed him most, when the world was collapsing under the weight of tyranny and brutality, when the future of freedom was still being decided on a dozen bloody battlefields, and that act alone changed everything. Most heroes are made by opportunity. Murphy was made by adversity. The obstacles he faced were never just enemy soldiers. They were the people who doubted him, the rules that tried to limit him, the fear that tried to stop him. He defeated all of them because of a simple belief. When someone is counting on you, you don't run, you stand. That belief is the heart of his story. It is what carried him through training when his size was mocked. It is what drove him to volunteer when others hesitated. It is what kept him charging forward in Italy, France, and Germany. It is what made him climb onto that burning tank destroyer in the snow, fight alone for over an hour, and refuse to leave his men behind. And long ago, because Murphy's life did not end with medals or movie screens. It did not end with applause or newspaper headlines. It ended the way it began, quietly, humbly, without glory. He died in a plane crash far from the battlefield, far from the cameras, far from the story that had defined him. And when news broke across the country, something remarkable happened. Americans mourned a man they felt they personally knew, not because he was perfect, not because he was fearless, but because he was real. He was the reminder that greatness doesn't come from privilege or expectation. It comes from character. It comes from sacrifice. It comes from the courage to do what others cannot. Murphy carried that message with him, even when nobody was listening. And that is why his story still matters. Audie Murphy was the man who stood his ground when the world needed him to. Today, when people stand before his grave at Arlington, they don't just see a soldier. They see a symbol of resilience. They see a symbol of the American spirit. They see a symbol of the ordinary man who became extraordinary because circumstances demanded it. His headstone is not big or flashy. It doesn't tower above the others. It doesn't need to. The words carved into that simple white stone tell the only story that matters. He was a soldier who answered the call. For if everything is falling apart and you are the only one left to act, what do you do? Murphy's answer was always the same. You act, you fight, you hold the line. Because courage isn't something you're born with. It's a choice. And Murphy made that choice every single time it mattered. So when we tell his story today, it is not because of how many medals he earned. It is not because he made history or became a Hollywood figure. It is not because he was larger than life. It is because he was proof of something deeper, that even the smallest soldier can carry the biggest destiny. Yes, that sometimes the heroes America needs are the ones nobody expected. And that is the final truth of Audie Murphy. He was called too weak to serve. He was mocked, rejected, and underestimated. He was supposed to fail. Instead, he became the man who held off an army alone. He became the man who never surrendered to fear. He became the man who protected his brothers until the end. And when ordinary people are forced to stand between freedom and tyranny, the strength of one man can change the fate of the world. It is the reminder that heroes are not born in glory. They are made in the fire,